So welcome to a behind the scenes look at local heroes. Take it away, Alyssa.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am coming to you virtually from my office here at Hennepin History Museum, and I am not the main event today. I'm merely going to be giving an introduction, and I'm going to leave the rest to the experts on medical history. But first, I just wanted to talk a bit generally about the content of the exhibit, and then talk a bit about what challenges I faced in trying to develop an exhibit in the middle of a pandemic. So obviously the name of the exhibit is called Local Heroes, and I developed it as a tribute to healthcare professionals. It covers roughly about a century's worth of history in Hennepin County. It begins in 1871 with the opening of the first hospital in Hennepin County. That was Cottage Hospital in Minneapolis. And then it goes up to the early 1970s, where we explore the innovations that were taking place at HCMC. So, oh, and I will say too, I might kind of gloss over things because I'm never quite sure what's interesting to everyone else. So if anyone has a question, feel free to put that into the chat. Sophie's going to keep an eye on that, but we'll also take a break later where we can answer some questions that you guys might have. The individuals that I wanted to include in the exhibit are what I would consider the unsung heroes. So you're not going to come in here and recognize a lot of the names of these doctors, nurses, administrators, pharmacists. The image you see there is of American Red Cross volunteers that are sewing hospital clothing that would have been sent overseas during World War I.
Hey, are you having trouble?
Oh, sorry, I should have asked people to mute. So if you're not Alyssa, go ahead and mute your mic.
So like I was saying, the image you see there.
Well, really.
Go ahead.
All right. The image you see here is of American Red Cross volunteers, and they are sewing hospital clothing that would have been sent overseas for sick and injured soldiers to wear while in hospital. And the uniform you see there is actually, you can see the woman who wore it in the photo behind it. So like I said, the individuals I identified are all innovators, trailblazers, and renowned in their field. And so those are who I identified which individuals and which institutions to include in the exhibit. So like I said, this is meant to be a tribute, which meant there was even more pressure to make sure the stories I was telling were accurate, making sure that I was honoring the memory of these individuals. So when I set about doing research, that was obviously my goal. Unfortunately, I started planning this exhibit at the beginning of the pandemic, which meant museums and libraries and archives across the state were closed, not only to the public, but even to those of us in the field. And staff at those institutions were laid off and furloughed, and my connection to a lot of these institutions started going away. So I faced a challenge in conducting research for this exhibit. So of course I relied on Hennepin History Museum's own archives and collections, and I used that as a foundation for the exhibit. I also, of course, relied upon online resources, digital archives and whatnot. But what I found to be my best resource were other individuals, and people became my primary source material for this exhibit. I was lucky enough to get to collaborate with Marie Manthe, who is a legendary local nurse, and she sits on the Heritage Committee at the University of Minnesota. So she was able to help me tell the stories that involve the University of Minnesota School of Nursing. I also was lucky enough to meet with Benjamin Mackay, who is the nephew of Francis Mackay Rains, who some of you may know was the first Black student to graduate from the University of Minnesota School of Nursing in 1932. And then, of course, last but not least, it is these wonderful ladies from the Hennepin Medical History Center, Carol and Rondine, of course, who will be speaking today, and also Claire Nelson. They helped me tell the stories of Dr. Claude Hitchcock and Dr. Ernest Ruiz and Margaret Hewitt. And so I feel really indebted to these individuals who were able to share their expertise with me, because because I don't come from a place where I had a lot of medical history knowledge, and they had an abundance. So not only did they share information with me, they loaned artifacts. You can see the kidney transporter on the screen right now that came from their institution. You'll also see on the left side now the fetoscope that was used by Margaret Hewitt, and the aorta compressor that was invented by Dr. Ernest Ruiz. So I'll say it, if I haven't said it enough already, I'd like to say thank you so much for your time, ladies. I couldn't have done this exhibit without you, so I'm so grateful. And so I think I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions someone might have either now or later. But before I finish, I'll just say that this exhibit will be open through summer. So hopefully any of you that are interested will be able to come see it in person someday.
Zoom recording. All right, I'm happy to welcome again Carol Oeltjenbruns and Rondine Mehling to talk about the collections at Hennepin Medical History Center. And I'll start by saying, Carol and Rondine are going to start by just walking you through their museum and talking a little bit about what you would see there once they've reopened. And then Carol will share some stories about the people that appear in our exhibit.
Okay, this is a patient that's set up in the museum from about the 20s to the 40s. In the top left-hand corner, you can see it's a bottle with some red inside, and that is the gauze for a blood transfusion to keep out the clots. All the tubing that you see for the blood transfusion and for the NG tube to the nose of the patient are all reusable. They had to be washed and cleaned between uses. And then just to the right of the bed, there's two white bags, and those are big bottles. And it's the first, considered possibly the first gastric suction that was invented.
Who is it?
What? The first gastric suction that was designed by Dr. Owen Wagenstein of the University of Minnesota. And then on the floor, you can see there's a wooden frame, and inside are a tiny white tile that were used in the early 1900s from the nursery of the old general. And that they are thanks to Claire Nelson, and her husband went there, essentially snuck up there with a flashlight and a pail when the general was ready to be destroyed and locked in security. And so they made several trips up and down and several trips with their Volkswagen. And so we had enough to make the floor for the patient's bed.
Do you want to add something to that, Rondine? It looked like you were.
Well, I just wanted to mention there is quite a story connected to Claire and her husband collecting these tiles, and they had to climb 3 stories because the OB department was on the 3rd floor of the hospital. And she may share that story with you another time.
We'll look forward to that. Should I go to the next slide?
Okay. Okay. Back.
It's quite crowded.
Yeah.
For more space.
Let's go on to another slide. I don't remember that. Okay. Here you can see the metal-looking box. It's a sterilizer, which Rondine used when she worked at General. Do you want to talk about that, Rondine?
Well, yeah, I worked on a women's floor, and we have both GYN and medicine patients. And so the instruments that we used on a lot of our GYN patients, that's where the nurse would clean and actually sterilize those for the next use. kind of archaic today.
And then on the right-hand side, you can see a loose leaf notebook with a red cover on it. And that contains all the class pictures of the medical residencies from 1924 to the present. So if you're interested in, looking at somebody's picture, that's available in the museum. And they're all identified. So you might, in case you worry that you won't recognize somebody, that you can look at the identification on the backside. And I think that's all for that one. And here, right in front of us, you can see that cabinet. It's closed. It's got the lab material in it. And then on the floor, almost on the floor to the right, is an old EKG machine, early EKG machine. And then on the right of the cabinet is the picture. You can see the horses. And that was our first ambulance. The first ambulances for the hospitals were horse-drawn carts, not a lot of spring protection or anything, just, not made for comfort.
Plus, we rented those horses from the city.
Okay. These are presentations of almost every department in the hospital. So whether you're from the kitchen or interested in the facilities, there's a picture of some of the workers at the boiler when they had to feed it coal to make it function. And this particular picture that it's open to is the stabilization and ED room. And on the other side is more of the emergency department pictures. And at the very top, you can't really see it, but it's Hilly Prouse, who was one of the nurses that was very involved in developing the emergency department.
And she started the History Center.
Yes. Yeah, she also collected much of this stuff. And this whole, she was the guru of the history and started collecting things when we moved from general into HCMC facilities. And this just shows a picture of the museum from one end to the other. And you can see it's quite full of things, a little mind-boggling when you first walk in. So it helps to have somebody with you to kind of help you focus on different things and pull out different things. And you can see the transport carrier there on the right-hand side on a stool. Did you want to talk at all about the China Roundy?
Oh, well, yes. In the glass box right here in front, back in the 40s and 50s, every Friday afternoon, they used to have teas for the staff, and the tea and coffee was served from silver coffee pots and teapots, and everything was served on china. Quite formal then.
And this is the picture of Hennepin County's collection. Next door to it is pretty much the same size room with as much stuff as there is in here that relates, and it was collected by the MMC Historical Library from St. Barnabas and Swedish hospitals. And you can find pins from many different nursing pins. We used to have, when we wore caps, you could tell what school somebody was from by their cap. And then we also got pins that were distinctive for each nursing school that you would wear on your uniform. And they also have a petrified orange that somebody that developed cholera from the Donaldson department store soda fountain had sent back after he was probably cleaning out his stuff, and he had been there as a young man, and it was so unusual to get an orange. I don't know how many of you remember that you would get a bag from Santa Claus, and a delicious apple was the big deal in the bottom of the bag. But anyway, he could not bring himself to eat the orange, and so he left it in his drawer, and he said the nurses knew he had it, but they didn't say anything. And then he carved his name and date in there and kept it until he sent it back with a letter of what he had done. And they also have a lot of lab equipment, an array of heart valves and lion gargles for under the eave of the hospital roof to protect it from Swedish hospital to protect you from whatever, and many, many things like that.
I think the other thing of interest in their collection is the King and Queen of Sweden. They gave money to the Swedish hospital because there were so many Swedish immigrants in Minnesota at the time. And so they actually have the signature of the King and Queen of Sweden, who I believe came to visit at one time.
Yeah. And they have the first admission form, which was just a card. And at that time, diversity was Swedish, Norwegian, German, etc. And the Swedish hospital's first patient was a German boy.
Carol and Rondine, there was just one question on this slide. Can you say more about the tea, who participated, like what staff participated in it and who served?
Well, it would have been like the Service League that would have served it. It's a little bit before my time, but for sure, all the nursing students and of course the hospital had programs for other students. So there'd be interns because it was in Harrington Hall and that was the nurses' dorm. And also I think the single residents stayed there. But general staff was invited also. So any employee really.
I actually read some reminiscence of some of the older alumni, and they said, well, it was partially to improve the etiquette of their nurses so they would fit into society better.
That's great.
This is Mary Jane, and I attended many of those teas. And yes, Mrs. Pillsbury, who was, funded the Service League, she felt that we student nurses needed etiquette.
Yeah, we still do.
I think this is the last slide that has photos of your gallery. So I'm just going to pause the recording in case there's other discussion or questions people have about things like this, what's in the gallery and the histories that you're talking about.
I'll start out. This is John.
And then maybe right now what the status is.
We tried to be open on Tuesdays and Thursdays. We have dwindling numbers of volunteers, so it isn't working that well. But we're hoping, so appointments are really better to make sure we're there. And we do those for different groups and even for one or two people. And we do, before the COVID started, we were going to start working with the Health Science Library in having exhibits there. It's with COVID and not, we don't go in and we do, you know, she's doing minimal things. Usually they have the plexiglass model of the hyperbaric chamber on display in there. And they wanted to have she wanted to have some things for students who came by and are working in the libraries to, when they get up to take a break, to have something to look at. So we hope to get back to putting exhibits in the health science library, which is more centralized than our little place in the basement. And we also have an illustrated timeline on the walls on the Skyway level of the new specialty clinic. And we do have some cases in the lower atrium besides the iron lung there that are available when we aren't there. They haven't been updated, you know, since COVID started, but there are other ways to find some of the information and pictures of things that we have.
And if people go to your website here, will there be a way to contact you?
I think so. It's a little bit in transition. So Karen gets information from different sources asking for stuff from there, but I'm not sure how the person contacted.
Actually, we're under the umbrella of the Health Foundation now.
Right.
But also we're volunteers. So the volunteer office also is another resource to reach us.
Yeah, you could call the Health Foundation and they'll.
Oh, Carol froze.
Yeah.
Call the Health Foundation and?
Yeah, I'm sure she was going to say to check with the Health Foundation. But like I say, and the volunteer office. There used to be on our former website, there was a link to reach us, but I'm not sure we have that with this one.
All right. Well, next up on our schedule is hearing some stories from Carol, but we need to get her video working again here. So while I'm working with Carol to do that, Alyssa, I'm going to ask the question that I had of you, which is whether you could say more. I mean, one thing that makes this exhibit so relevant right now is the COVID-19 pandemic. But I would imagine that trying to work with all of these community collaborators that you've been working with was complicated by the pandemic. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about what your process was given COVID-19, what were the challenges, how you got around them, etc.
Yeah, certainly it was a lot of Zoom calls and phone calls and emails, and Carol and Rondine did luckily find a way for me to visit their institution to retrieve artifacts and to gather some of that research that I put into the exhibit. But yeah, as I said before, it was a huge challenge to try to do research in the way that I normally would before the pandemic. But I suppose it was fitting, you know, in an exhibit that is meant to talk about how history repeats itself. Of course, you know, the 1918 pandemic is covered in local heroes quite frequently. So it almost seemed fitting, but honestly, I found the experience of curating this exhibit and having so many people to collaborate with and being able to rely on the expertise of others that actually worked in healthcare was actually quite a delight, and I enjoyed it.
Still waiting to hear from Carol. I'm going to give her a call and see if maybe we might at least get her voice here to tell us our stories. Is there anything else that you'd like to say about the exhibit, Alyssa? Sorry to put you on the spot here.
I've got a question, so maybe Rondine could answer this.
Lovely.
And with Wonderland was this place down by Lake Street that had Ferris wheels and all sorts of things, but they also had babies and incubators. And I was wondering, and you know, everybody went to see these little teeny babies because they wouldn't have survived without these first incubators. And I was wondering, was there a relationship between the house that these babies were kept in and General Hospital?
Not that I recall. I remember hearing about that house and that happening, but to my knowledge, no, I don't
Yeah.
think so. Carol might know more about that.
Okay.
I will say, which I think you're probably aware of, that of course our newborn intensive care unit was one of the first in the state, and we have wonderful nurses now. I don't recall when that first opened. Dr. Martha Strickland was the founder of our newborn ICU. We have a fair amount of information in our files about her.
Mm-hmm. Alyssa, are you aware of any connection between hospitals and the Wonderland?
No, I wish I had more to share. We do, in our archives here, we have a collection of nurses with babies in those incubators that you're talking about. So we have one of those images in our archives, but I don't have more information about connections they may have
I
had
bet
at
we'll
the hospital.
have to talk to Susan Weir about that.
Sophie, if you want to flip back to some of the photos from the exhibit, perhaps I could talk about some of the artifacts. All right, so yeah, this is perfect. I thought maybe I could just kind of walk you through some of these until we can get Carol back online here. The cape that you're looking at on the right side of the screen, that dates to the early 20th century, made by a local Minneapolis dressmaker, and it belonged to Dr. Catherine Burns. Doc Kate, as she was known, graduated, well, she was awarded her medical degree from the University of Minnesota in 1886, and she was the first woman to do so. She went on to become the first physician of either gender in Hopkins, where she practiced medicine for 30 years. The mortal and pestle you see on the left there was came to us from Schneider Drug before that business closed permanently in 2019, and that mortal and pestle date to the early 1900s. And then there on the small pedestal towards kind of in the middle of the picture towards the back is a medal that was awarded to Lydia Whiteside. She received her nurse's training in downtown Minneapolis and went on to volunteer to serve as a nurse in World War I, where she lost her life during the 1918 flu epidemic, actually. And so she was awarded this medal posthumously. Sophie, any news there? You want to maybe go to a different picture?
I've got Carol on the phone, so let's see.
Okay, great.
Carol, speak for us, and they're going to.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'll talk about the Reverend Knickerbacker first. He was an Episcopalian priest.
Carol, give me 1 minute to get to that slide.
Okay.
Okay. And everyone on the call, just let me know if you can't hear Carol. Give me a wave and we'll adjust. Okay, we're ready for you.
Okay. He realized that with the industry coming to Minneapolis at that time, that there would be, especially men coming from outstate, that would not have family here to take care of them when they got sick, because at that time most people took care of their sick people at home, and so he finally talked the city council into giving him, and they gave him a house many of the hospitals were started in houses at that time. Even the university had some houses on Washington Avenue before they built brick and mortar. So they gave him a house, and but they didn't give him any operating expenses. So every morning he had to go. I'm trying to find the Zoom here. To the merchants of Minneapolis with his basket and give supplies for the hospital, food and whatever they would need. And so they wrote a book entitled, they have a book in the MMC collection entitled With Faith and a Market Basket by Jean Terry. It tells the story of Reverend Knickerbacker and the evolution of a hospital to St. Barnabas. And I think you have a picture of St. Barnabas on display, right, Sophie?
I do. That's what we're looking at. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's built later, and if they were the first hospital in this area to have air conditioning, and they also had a big amphitheater for the operating room in that hospital. But one of the suggestions that gave for future hospitals putting in air conditioning was, be sure you put a thermostat in every room. Okay, here we are.
I think she's signing on to Zoom. She was waiting for her computer to load while she was talking.
Do you know what?
We don't see you yet.
Okay, so this is beautiful hospital of St. Barnabas. And you can see the carriage that would have been drawn by horses. And it was a very special design for, upper middle class type people, I guess. And I think.
Do you know whereabouts it was located?
It was right along in that same area that it was today. Let me see.
Okay.
The cottage house was on Washington Avenue and 9th Street. And then this hospital they were all very close together so that they could combine them. And as they merged, it was just a matter of being across the street. And they started a nursing program shortly after they built this hospital. Okay. Oh my goodness, here is Sister Kenny. Well, I am so glad to see you, Sister Kenny. We're anxious to hear about your
time here in Minneapolis. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about it. I know you came here in 1940. Yes, it seems like just yesterday that I came to Minneapolis. I had been traveling around to different doctors. I started in the Austrian bush, taking care of patients there, and learned that the way the doctors were treating the patients was totally inappropriate. Oh, and they wouldn't listen. They just wouldn't listen. So I came to America and traveled on the East Coast. And of course, they wouldn't listen. I'm a woman and no formal training. And I finally was not getting anywhere, so I was actually headed home. And I stopped at Mayo Clinic. I mean, Mayo Clinic is well known. And they actually listened to me. They thought I had some interesting concepts, but they didn't have any patients. So they told me to go up to General Hospital. They'd probably have patients. So we got on the bus and went up to General Hospital. I thought, General Hospital in Minneapolis, I'd never heard of it. But anyway, I did a lecture to the doctors, including Dr. Knapp and Dr. John Pohl. And yes, I know I ranted on about an hour and a half about how nobody would listen to me. But anyway, they were willing to listen. And so Dr. Knapp was thinking, you know, my patients I'm not getting anywhere with my patients. I'm really not doing them any good. And so he said I could come the next morning and he would take the plaster prisons off from this lab that he was treating and let me examine it. So that morning we came back and we examined this patient in the lobby of General Hospital. I mean, it's a beautiful, the columns were gorgeous, marble everywhere. Why, it was just wonderful, but not a lot of privacy. But anyway, he agreed to let me work with this boy, and I was able to bring back some function and get him started on the way to recovery. And so they allowed me to have one of the floors in their new annex building to care for patients. And so that first year, I took care of about 22 patients, and 11 of them left the hospital with no deformities or anything. And the other ones did have some problems, but they were very workable. And so oh, I've got to tell you, Dr. Knapp was so gracious. He knew I was very short of funds when I got there. And so he took me into his house, and he also showed me around Minneapolis. Oh, it's a beautiful city. We went out to Lake Minnetonka, and I'm standing there on the shores of Lake Minnetonka, beautiful sky blue waters. You know, we know about the land of sky blue waters in Australia. And here I was on looking across this beautiful sky blue water lake at the woods beyond. Oh, it was wonderful. But anyway, we would sit and talk in the evening about my concepts and what I understood them to be. And he was very interested, a very smart man. And as I said, very gracious. He helped us find an apartment and everything. And then after I had the success with these 22 patients, he and Dr. Buel wrote an article about the method and how the outcomes were so very good. I mean, you're probably wondering now, why would she even know anything about that? Well, my brother was considered a weakling in the Australian Army, and I just couldn't have that. So I did study on my own anatomy and how muscles work, and we made string models of how they would work, and I worked with him, and he got to be the strongest man in the Australian Army. And so I also then started taking care of people in the Australian bush. And one time I came across a little 2-year-old child in a home that was just sobbing and wailing and all contorted. And so I called my doctor, Dr. Connell, that was in charge of my work. And I told him about this child. And he said, it sounds like polio. No treatment. Do what you can. Well, I put the hot packs on the child's limbs, and she started to settle down and stopped whimpering and crying. And so I treated her, and she recovered very rapidly. And so I had other patients in a clinic eventually that I took care of it and did very well. Of course, the doctor said I just had easy patients, but we just took patients as they came. So anyway, they gave me some money to travel to Europe and America to tell about this treatment. And as I was saying, nobody would listen until I got to general. And they always had some polio patients, probably like in Minneapolis, about 200 or so, I think. And so they always had patients, but I was there in 1940. And after this article, then other areas wanted me to come and train their people in the hot path and retraining muscle type treatment. See, I felt that the deformities were caused by spasticity, and the doctors felt that it was a flaccid process, and the flaccid muscles were pulling the stronger muscles out of shape, where I felt that the spastic muscles were pulling the joints out of shape. Just very simple explanation. But anyway, by 1946, they had a horrendous epidemic in Minnesota. Oh my goodness. They had to get, other buildings and everything. They started in having maybe 20 a week to 40. The third week it was 92. And so actually the Infantile Paralysis Foundation does come out to help areas that were having problems, but they opened up a general hospital, and then the Sheltering Arms, which was a rehab unit, took some patients, and then we still didn't have enough room. And so Hubert Humphrey was mayor at the time, and we had some feisty little conversations. We're both kind of ornery, and he finally sent a telegram to President Truman, who he knew, and we got permission to put patients in Fort Snelling in the Naval Hospital that wasn't being used at the time. So we put patients there. We still didn't have enough room. After a while, we filled that up. And so we went to the mayor, and we needed another facility. So they gave us Dowling School, which they gave it to us on July 29th. And on July 30th, by noon, we had over 20 patients being cared for in that hospital. Why, everybody worked together. It was just incredible. And even the foundation was surprised at how they wrote it up in a Modern Hospital article, calling it the miracle in Minneapolis. I mean, they couldn't believe how we could cooperate and work together and get so much done. But anyway, so we finally survived that. Every summer you would have, usually in the summer, more children would be affected. And, the movie theaters were closed. You couldn't go swimming. Tonsillectomies had to be done early before summer started, and all sorts of things. Every summer. And so I stayed until 1950. And then it was kind of, my health wasn't doing well. And so I decided to go back to Australia. And actually I wrote a letter to say goodbye to the people of America that was published in the Woman's Home Companion, telling them how I respected the people, the women and children especially. And I said that the torch has been passed on, and it was lit in the Australian bush 42 years ago, and now can be safely passed on to others to hold aloft and keep burning. I pass it on especially to the women and children of America and the world, because they have such a devotion to children. And so I left. Well, I want to tell you, I see there's some recipes here you have. I have these children needed a lot of nourishment and good food. And so I have my own recipes that I had the kitchen make. Oh, those kitchen people were so nice. They made their own recipes too, but they used some of mine too. Oh, Spanish rice, macaroni and cheese. I mean, these are mostly children. And apricot fluff. I mean, that's, you need a little dessert, don't you? So anyway, I went back to Australia in 1950, and I heard later that they had another terrible epidemic in Minneapolis in 1952 that involved more people, more patients, but they had better treatment, such as hot packs and retraining muscles and that sort of thing. So the consequences were a little less than in 1946. So anyway, I went back to Australia, and that's where I passed my last years. Well, thank you, Sister Kenny. And so Sister Kenny died in November of 1952, and she, Dr. Sona Salk's vaccine came out in 52 and started, several million children were vaccinated, and eventually it was standard to have children vaccinated. And by the late 1970s, they had no more polio in the United States and in the country. So they had a few that they had developed an oral polio that was used, that was actually a live vaccine, I guess. And they had some children that got polio from that, but there were none that got polio otherwise. And you see, many of the children would be staying there for months. And here's a picture in one of the facilities, probably Sister Kenny's facility, with the librarian and some of the children there. So then we move on to Dr. Hitchcock. And he was appointed to be the chief of surgery of General Hospital. He had trained at the university under Dr. Wagenstein, and Dr. Wagenstein appointed him to be the chief of General Hospital, Minneapolis General at the time. He had a lot of energy, and he was always interested in learning and training. He could be kind of a stern administrator, but he was very dedicated to medicine. He's responsible for, in part responsible for the MMRF, the Minneapolis, Minneapolis Medical Research Foundation, and did a lot of research. He was very interested in kidney disease, and he did the first kidney transplant in 1963 in the upper Midwest. And shortly after that, the person needed dialysis, and he took some residents with him and went to Washington, where they had a Swedish freezer dialysis machine that he had brought back to Minneapolis and dialyzed the patient. And so he also was instrumental in developing the RKDP, the Regional Kidney Dialysis Center program, that is well respected and throughout the country. He was also instrumental in getting the hyperbaric chamber in Minneapolis in 1963, and that also came from Australia. We know it being used for carbon monoxide and for the bends, but he felt they might need it for the organ transplant surgery and different surgeries that they were trying to do. It ended up that they didn't need to do that, but it was used also for gangrene infections from Clostridium, and they were able to treat that in the hyperbaric chamber. Now, many of the clients that they have come for wound healing from radiation wounds, and some skin grafts are saved through going through the hyperbaric chamber. When we started the new hyperbaric chamber in the 2000s, I can't come up with a date right now, but they said that ours was one of probably less than a dozen in the country that would operate 24/7. So that's kind of interesting statistic, I think. And we'll talk more about Hitchcock when we talk about Dr. Reece, but Hitchcock retired in 1988 after being the chief of surgery for 33 years. Yeah, let's look at the transplant carrier that you have. They use this carrier when the residents would go to the other hospitals, or they might even fly on a small plane to go and pick up the organ and come back and put it in from the donor to the recipient. Before that, they thought they'd have to do it from living person to living person. And that's why they thought they might need that hyperbaric chamber, but it was determined a little bit through ethics that was not necessary. And now if you ride on a plane and they talk about a precious cargo, that's an organ that they're delivering from one place to the other. And a pilot said it was kind of nice to have that opportunity, because you could take off first at the airport and land first at the other airport. So this, and now we mentioned when we were in the museum that I think they use an igloo type thing now, but there's a metal case inside that locks together, and then you put ice around it. And here's Dr. Reece. He also was a surgeon under Dr. Hitchcock, and things in the ER were just not doing very well. And Dr. Hitchcock felt that it needed to be organized and improved and made more efficient. So he asked Dr. Reece if he would take over, thinking it might just be a part-time thing. In 1971, this was started. And so Dr. Reece talked it over with his wife, Bertie, which is so like Dr. Reece. I mean, you know, some people would talk it over with another colleague, but he talked it over with his wife. And he decided that he would do it if Dr. Hitchcock would agree to call that it was an emergency department, not under surgery anymore, and that it would be an independent department. And so from then on, it was called an emergency department. And shortly after, Dr. Pat Lilja and Robert Long, who were surgery residents, decided they would be interested in this emergency residency. And so they were his first two residents. And they came to him with an article about Cincinnati developing an emergency medical service. Well, he thought, well, we can do that too. So he felt there should be a stabilization room in this emergency room. It had not, there was no other stabilization room that he knew about. And so he had to develop that and figure out what they needed there. And some of the items he made, like the aortic compressor that's on display, we'll look at that later. And he said about 75% of them probably didn't work. He did a lot of work with airways. And so they finally worked out and got the equipment for the stabilization room. And then they, of course, needed nurses. And so Hilly Prouse was, and Audrey Cooney were very instrumental as nurses working with developing emergency medical service, the different techniques they would have to learn and different equipment, some of which wasn't even invented yet. We had just started CPR, and the first responders could do CPR, and they thought that was wonderful. They could bring patients and have a chance at bringing a patient they might have declared dead at the scene, but they could bring them to the emergency department. And at first he thought it was going to be for cardiac patients, but as soon as it opened, they brought every kind of patient that needed a lot of critical care there. So anyway, and he also, okay, go back to that slide. So you see the aortic compressor there. And then on the other side, because this was a brand new idea to have emergency medical service, they had no curriculum. And so he developed the curriculum, and we have many of the pages in a loose leaf notebook in the museum. And this is one of the drawings. Many of the pictures were drawings like this of how to intubate, how to do all the procedures. And we were about probably the second emergency medical service in the country, with this Cincinnati one in Ohio being the first by probably 6 months. And so the first graduates were Pat Lilia, and he became very interested in paramedic. They called him the father of paramedic training. And so Hilly Prouse and Dr. Hitchcock, Dr. Reece would go out to outlying parts of the state and train nurses and doctors there, so they would know how to take care of emergency conditions in their area as well. And so he was very much on reaching out and making sure everyone was working together. One of the things he was interested was preventing some of the patients from ever coming to the emergency room. And so he had a PharmD work with another person they hired to develop a poison control, the beginning of the poison control system that we have. And one of the first publications was Friends and Foes of the Plant World. And that was used by the public for many years. I think they've updated it now, but and Bernice, his wife, would go to schools and they would talk about the things that were poison and the Mr. Yuck things, and try to prevent the need for people to come to the emergency department with poisonings. And the line is available to both laymen and professionals. And then they had heard that there was a plane coming in which was having trouble with their landing gear, and they had phoned the runway, but Patrick Leah came in an ambulance, and Ernie was there in an ambulance. And as they sat and waited for this plane to come, which ended up landing without incident, he thought, we are not prepared for something like this. And so shortly after that event, he called together the Civil Defense, Fire Department, ambulance services, and they worked together to develop a regional partnership to take care of emergencies and be prepared for catastrophic events, and started having drills routinely, and which they still do today. They also were able to get a grant from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to work on a communication system. And they got about $500,000 to start this emergency system. And that became the foundation of the regional communication system that we know today. Oh, there's an amber alert. I'm sorry, I didn't put my phone away. He stayed interested in learning and all his life. He came to the state conferences, which for those of you who don't know are conferences, weekly conferences about patients that were in the emergency room that they felt they could process what had happened and use them for learning training. And he came, and since we were involved in the museum, he felt we could come and see what was new and maybe try and see what we should try to save for, you know, what was history now. And so we also, Rondine and I, were able to go to the state conferences. And he came, and when Dr. Hitchcock, who followed him, retired, Clinton, Dr. Joseph Clinton retired, he started bringing Dr. Reece to the state conferences as his health was failing. And Dr. Reece passed away in November of 2020. But he has done much for emergency medicine and for the city of Minneapolis. And he has many supporters in his residents that are so involved in teaching and everything. And so why do we study history? In 1923, this Dr. Holt told the American Pediatric Society, if you today have a broader vision of your science than the men of 25 years ago, it is not because your sight is better, but because you stand upon their shoulders. So, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Carol and Rondine, for sharing your stories, the depth of your knowledge of these people and of the history of HCMC and medicine, I think is so clear, not only from studying it as volunteers at this museum, but from actually, you know, being medical practitioners yourself. I'm just so grateful that Alyssa brought you in as collaborators to this exhibit and came up with this idea for the program. And I know we all really benefited from hearing from you today, and to others who have shared as well. We really value your contributions.